All right, let's jump right into it. Welcome to this explainer. Well, we're going to unpack the incredibly complex and fast-moving events of Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota. We're strictly looking at the source material today to break down the timeline, the heavily conflicting accounts, and the hard data behind what actually happened on the ground. So let's start with the central question of our entire explainer. How in the world does a targeted financial probe transform into a historic, incredibly chaotic federal sweep? Because we're talking about a shift in scope that completely upended daily life in the Twin Cities in a matter of weeks. It's almost like looking at a split screen. On one side, you have the stated initial focus, a joint task force going after healthcare fraud. But then, on the other side, you have the reality that actually materialized, a massive, unprecedented federal immigration crackdown sweeping right across the state. Let's look at Section 1, the Medicaid fraud pretext. Okay, so this all kicks off with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison partnering up with federal agencies, including the FBI. They were building a case to indict people who allegedly defrauded the state's medical assistance programs out of $90 million. It was a very specific, targeted focus. They were going after providers in early developmental and home-based services who were allegedly billing the state for services that, well, literally never happened. Moving to Section 2, enter Operation Metro Surge. Now, this is where the pivot happens. The Department of Homeland Security steps in and announces what they officially dubbed Operation Metro Surge, deploying 2,000 agents to the Twin Cities. And the initial explanation from federal officials was that they were specifically targeting individuals of Somali descent, allegedly tied to that exact fraudulent activity we just talked about. But the sheer scale was massive. DHS itself called it the largest immigration enforcement operation ever carried out. Section 3, Escalation and Chaos. Based on the sources, the tactics from ICE and Customs and Border Protection escalated incredibly fast. We're not just talking about targeted raids on specific homes or businesses. Agents were conducting widespread arrests in everyday public civilian spaces. They were sweeping Target stores, local restaurants, public bus stops. They even went inside Aquila Elementary and Columbia Heights schools, right into Twin Cities hospitals, and set up document checkpoints at the airport. It severely disrupted daily civic life across the board. And the community fallout documented in the sources is just staggering. We see reports of multiple U.S. citizens wrongfully detained, literally dragged from their vehicles. People who were just trying to observe and monitor the operations reported getting pepper sprayed. There's even a deeply concerning report from school officials about a 5-year-old child, Liam Ramos, who was reportedly used as bait by federal agents just to get inside his home before he and his father were taken to a detention center all the way down in Texas. Section 4, Tragic Fatalities and Fallout. And tragically, things turned fatal in January. On January 7th, 37-year-old American citizen Renee Good was shot and killed in her car by an ICE agent. Exactly a week later, on January 14th, a Venezuelan man named Julio Cesar Sosa Silas was shot, and on that very same day, Victor Manuel Diaz was reported dead while in ICE custody. Then, on January 24th, Alex Preddy, an American intensive care nurse for the VA, was shot and killed by Border Patrol agents while filming them. Now, we have to look impartially at both sides here because the accounts of these shootings are completely fractured. On one side, you have federal officials and the Trump administration firmly defending the agents, stating they were acting in self-defense against violent armed attackers. But on the flip side, you have bystander videos, eyewitness accounts, and journalists heavily contradicting those government claims, reporting that the victims were completely unarmed, just holding cell phones, or actively trying to run away when they were shot. Section 5. Strikes and legal pushback. So how did the citizens respond? With massive, unprecedented protests. Tens of thousands of people marched in Minneapolis. This energy quickly escalated into a Minnesota general strike on January 23rd, and then a national shutdown strike on January 30th. It absolutely paralyzed the region. Widespread business closures, canceled schools, you name it. And in response to that unrest, the federal government actually issued grand jury subpoenas to local leaders to investigate if they were obstructing federal law enforcement. But the pushback wasn't just happening in the streets. The legal battles were intensifying rapidly. The state of Minnesota, along with Minneapolis and St. Paul, flat out sued the Department of Homeland Security to halt the deployments, calling it an unconstitutional commandeering of their state. And get this, a federal judge found that ICE had violated at least 96 separate court orders in the month of January alone, mostly related to wrongful detentions. This legal fight really highlights the intense political clash right at the center of this whole event. Attorney General Pam Bondi sent a letter demanding state cooperation, asking for access to state databases and for Minnesota to repeal its sanctuary policies to restore the order of law. Meanwhile, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Attorney General Keith Ellison pushed back hard, officially calling the entire operation a campaign of retribution and an unlawful invasion of their communities. Section 6. The operation's true cost. Operation Metro Surge had an absolutely staggering financial impact. For the city of Minneapolis alone, it cost over $200 million, and that's just in the single month of January 2026. When we break down that cost granularly, you really see the profound ripple effect across the community. Local businesses lost $81 million in revenue. Workers lost $47 million in wages. We're seeing millions lost just in hotel cancellations. But perhaps the most striking number here is the human toll. Over 76,000 people experienced food insecurity as a direct result of these operational disruptions. And this brings us to the Freedom of Information Act data released after the operation concluded. This is where the stark contrast between the initial stated pretext and the final reality is completely exposed. The data shows a total of 3,789 arrests were made. But look at the demographics here. Remember the initial stated goal of targeting Somali-led fraud networks? Well, the data shows that the vast majority of those arrested were from Ecuador and Mexico. Fewer than 3%, just 106 people out of thousands, were from Somalia. And absolutely none of them were tied to the social services fraud that supposedly sparked this whole deployment in the first place. And when you look at the criminal records of the arrestees, the reality of who was actually caught up in this surge becomes glaringly obvious. 75% of the people arrested had no criminal record whatsoever. Only 12% had an existing record. Plus, the data reveals that 35% of all cases were just collateral arrests from generalized street sweeps rather than targeted actions based on actual warrants. So while the surge technically ended with a formal drawdown in February 2026, the massive legal, economic, and human fallout in Minnesota is very much still unfolding. The state is now navigating hundreds of wrongful detention lawsuits, not to mention a community that has been fundamentally altered by the chaotic events of those 2 months. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Looking at all the data and the events we've reviewed today, in the delicate balance between federal enforcement and local civil liberties, how long will it take for a community to heal from this kind of profound disruption? And honestly, how do you even begin to rebuild trust once the dust settles? Thank you so much for exploring the source material with us today.